Good afternoon, everyone. Name is Dan Georgescu, Director in the Restructuring Services, PwC Middle East, and I lead the Working Capital and Liquidity Management service offering across the region. As it was well introduced, we'll talk about working capital in the capital of capitals, as we've been told today. I'm going to try and keep it brief and succinct, as we've only got 10 minutes to cover quite a bit of ground. So in terms of the study, we publish the study every year. It's an annual study. We analyze the public and private businesses across the Middle East where public information is available across the private businesses. This year's study, we have 450 companies with revenue above $10 million, including in the study. Some of the key findings that we've seen in the study, as mentioned earlier, this is $50 billion of trapped liquidity on the balance sheets of corporates across the Middle East. That inefficiency is costing circa $5 billion in terms of an estimated weighted average cost of capital of 10%. We've also seen last year working capital performance has deteriorated by half a day on an overall basis. That's the equivalent of $922 million of added working capital onto the balance sheets of the corporates across the Middle East. The other key trend that we've noticed is, for a second year in a row, the profitability has declined. And in 2023 alone, that dropped by 130 basis points. We've seen that, and that is actually impacting the cash flows of businesses, right? And which ultimately leads to the financial distress and the other situations that we've seen across the region. 130 basis points is the equivalent of $8.7 billion of profitability that was missed out in 2023. That trend has predominantly been one led by the cost of goods sold increase that's continued on the back of the COVID pandemic and the global inflation. The other bit, The other bit that I want to cover here is the debt, right? Total debt. This is going up consistently over the last 5 years. So in 2023, total debt went up by 4%. The underlying driver there is long-term debt. So we've seen a mixture of actual new loans onto the market, but we've also seen quite a number of restructurings and refinancing of short-term liabilities onto longer term to align with the cash flow generations of various businesses. Just to deep dive a little bit into the various cycles of working capital, as I've mentioned earlier, the deterioration of half a day, we went from 107.6 days in 2022 to 108.1 days in 2023. 2022 and 2023 are actually the first 2 years where the Middle East working capital performance has dropped below the 110 kind of threshold, if you'd like, and we've been doing this study since 2017. So over the last couple of years, this is the first time when that happened. What that means in terms of the various cycles of working capital, if we look at the days sales outstanding, that measures on average how many days it takes to collect your cash from your customers. That's improved slightly to 85.1 days. In terms of the inventory management and the days inventory outstanding, that's actually deteriorated slightly to 93.2 days. And finally, in terms of the days payables outstanding, that's dropped by a day to 65.5. So that shows a bit of a trend there, as you'd notice from the COVID times when everybody stopped paying their suppliers or delayed the payments. There is a correction that's happening in terms of the payments to suppliers across the majority of the region. Coming to the 50 billion and how that's spread across the region, I think it's important just to understand how the number is calculated and how we arrive to that estimation. So that's a company by company analysis of their individual performance against the median performance in their respective sector or industry. So in other words, if all the companies in our study would improve to the median in that particular sector, that would release $50 billion of working capital into the GCC economies. On the other side, looking at the net working capital day trends across the region, you'll notice quite varied trends from 44 days in Bahrain all the way to 141 days in KSA. You've got to look at it as also a mix of industries and various sectors, but also the sample of companies, right? Most of the companies in the study are in UAE and KSA, and more than 50% of them are UAE and KSA companies. So some of the other geographies have a smaller pool of companies with publicly available information that are present there. But if I just focus for a second on KSA, got 141 days. It's the largest working capital cycle across the region, and it's been like that for the last 5 years. Right? From 2019 until now, every single year, KSA has had the longest cycle. What's driving that? Well, they do have the longest inventory cycle in the region, and they do have one of the largest cash collection cycles in the region. But on the flip side, from 2019 until now, KSA has consistently improved its working capital performance. So it is coming down, but there's definitely more value that can be extracted from the companies in the kingdom. Another cut that we typically do in the study is just looking at a sector by sector analysis. And if we leave the sectors aside, agnostic of any sector, we had 54% of companies improve working capital performance year on year from 2022 to 2023. If you take that and you look over a 3-year period, how many companies have actually improved working capital for 3 consecutive years, that drops down to 9% only. So from 54% only to 9%. So there's a lot of companies that are focusing on a one-off exercise, job done, that's it, move on. If I look at some of the sectors, and I'll probably pick on the engineering and construction, as most people in the room have been involved in that sector one way or another over the last couple of years, we do continue to see financial distress, right, in the construction sector across the region. And then the cash flow performance hasn't been great over the last year. There's 24.5 days deterioration only in 1 year, in 2023 alone. That's about 12%, bringing it up to about 222 days of the full working capital cycle in the construction sector, which is putting more pressure onto the corporates. Just to wrap it up, as I can see, I have under 2 minutes left. A couple of points I've touched upon. We see an increased interest in working capital. A lot more corporates, a lot more executives do take the topic seriously. They want to address it. There's an increased also demand in the market. However, most of the times, these are tactical improvements. And what do I mean by tactical? Let's throw in some people. Let's go harder after the collections. Let's increase the number of calls. Let's liquidate some inventories, or let's just delay the payments to the suppliers. There's very few companies that go about in a more systematic manner to say, do we need to change our operating model? Do we need to change the processes, the systems to actually drive that sustainable change that will keep the liquidity going? As I mentioned earlier, you do a tactical change, take your foot off your gas, 6 months later, the working capital performance will come back to what it used to be before, because your systems and your operating model are designed to operate at that level. So what do we recommend in terms of kind of the next 12 months, and where do we see that there's a need for companies to focus a bit more of their efforts? Number one, working capital analytics. There's a lot of data now. There's a lot of information available. It's not used. It's not harnessed and then analyzed and presented in such a way that can enable decision-making for individuals. You always have to kind of scatter around and look at too many reports, and it takes 2-3 weeks to actually get some information. Number two, enhancing billing and collection processes, making sure you can get invoices out which are accurate, on time, and then you can collect that money in a reasonable manner. Optimizing the credit risk management. This is where it comes to your credit policy. Are you taking too much risk? Are you enforcing your credit policy properly, and you don't end up writing off too much bad debt at the end of the year? Is there a focus on inventory, the inventory replenishment and planning? Are they ordering how much they're supposed to order and when they're supposed to order, and we don't end up with multiple sales in Dubai Mall every other 2 weeks? And then implementing working capital governance structure. What I mean by the governance structure is the thing that brings everything together, where you have your KPIs, you have your metrics, you'd have the awareness that's within your own company, and then you have incentives that drive everything, so that brings kind of the cash culture and brings it all together. I'm actually bang on time, but I would be happy to take any questions after the event. So thank you all.